These notes are going to cover pretty much the end of the Cold War and a little bit of the breakup of all the communist nations after. So, this is going to be a really important part because it's going to lead into the modern world that we kind of know today, and it's going to go all the way up into the 1990s. There's not a ton of vocabulary for this unit, but the vocab that is there is kind of difficult because a lot of it is Russian words and foreign words that you probably have never heard of. So the first one is mujahideen. It means Muslim religious warrior. That's for our purpose. There's obviously a couple different meanings, but this word is still very important because this is what a lot of the modern day terrorist groups call themselves. And you're going to see that a lot of the terrorist groups that we know today are formed near the end of the Cold War. Glasnost and Perestroika, we're going to go over those, but wanted you to have them here so you could go back and look at them. An ethnic group, we've gone over this before, but it's going to be very important for the end of the Cold War. You have to remember that an ethnic group is a population of people that they have a unique characteristics that they all share together. So they have a unique race, language, culture, religion, nationality, and it kind of groups them together in their own group. And ethnic groups are going to be very important at the end of the Cold War because of a lot of the conflicts they're going to cause. Detente is a French word, and it means cooling of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Again, we'll go over that in the notes. And then the European Union is just the organization in Europe that forms during and near the end of the Cold War, where Europe becomes more connected to each other. So we went up to like the 1970s in our last notes in part three. And in the 1970s, the United States and the Soviet Union begin going through the process of detente, where they begin to improve relations. If you remember that the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin airlift, a lot of these major issues that the Soviet Union and the United States had almost brought them to the brink of nuclear war. And as we've learned, in a nuclear war, no one wins. So, because the United States had been improving its relations with China, it made it so the USSR had to begin to actually deal with the United States because now they didn't have their other powerful ally, China, and NATO was beginning to kind of overtake the Soviets. So the US and the USSR began to relax tensions between each other. They began cultural exchanges. The first McDonald's begins to open in the Soviet Union. There's exchanges of businessmen learning to create businesses. There's exchanges of technology. Students are allowed to go over to Moscow University. Students are allowed to come over to American universities from the Soviet Union. Instead of fighting each other through proxy wars as much, the US and the Soviet Union also begin to try and solve their issues diplomatically. They use the UN, they use their ambassadors. There's actually a phone put in the office of the president and the Soviet premier where they can call each other directly if there's something they disagree on so that it can de escalate those tensions and not cause a nuclear war. The most important thing, though, is they begin the process of nuclear disarmament. So during the arms race, they made more missiles than they could ever use. The United States at one point had enough missiles to destroy the Soviet Union 10 times over. And they begin to limit the production and use of those weapons. So the first thing they do is they ban testing of nuclear weapons. Obviously, when you test a nuclear weapon, it causes a lot of radiation fallout. You can't even go to that area anymore for another like 10,000 years. So they just ban that. They create what's called the SALT and the START treaties, which all these are is limiting the amounts and types of nuclear weapons that they can make and beginning to destroy some nuclear weapons. And finally, the UN signs the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And all this means is that the nations that already have nuclear weapons can keep those nuclear weapons, but the nations that don't have nuclear weapons cannot develop them. It's just stop the spread of nuclear weapons across the world so that it is making it less likely there will be a nuclear war. Detente doesn't last very long, though, because in 1979, the Soviet Union invades the tiny nation of Afghanistan. Afghanistan had a communist government in place by the USSR. You can see that Afghanistan bordered the USSR. And it had been facing a rebellion by Muslim fundamentalists. So the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan to try and support the communist regime there. This ends detente because obviously tensions are racketing back up. The United States isn't going to want communism to stay or spread in Afghanistan, and that's going to cause tensions between the two countries. The main issue for the Soviets is the war in Afghanistan does not go as planned. The Mujahideen form, it's kind of like a loose coalition of different rebel groups to oppose the Soviet Union. They're guerrilla fighters, they're very fundamentalist Muslim. A lot of them are formed under the banner of a group called the Taliban. And they are supplied by the United States. If you're fighting the Soviets, the United States gives you weapons and money. And one of the guys that receives a lot of funding is that guy in the upper left hand corner, Osama bin Laden. So originally, Osama bin Laden was actually an ally of the United States to fight the Soviet Union to get communism out of Afghanistan. But then in the 90s, he would turn on the United States and develop his Muslim fundamentalist views that would lead to Al Qaeda becoming the danger that it is. The war eventually ends 10 years later in 1989 when the Soviet Union withdraws from Afghanistan. The biggest effect of this war is it completely drained the Soviet Union of resources. It broke their military. It broke the morale of the country because so many soldiers were killed. But mostly, it just made it so the Soviet Union was broke. They spent so much money on the war, they didn't have any money left over to do anything else. So during the same time as the war in Afghanistan, the Soviet economy was stagnating, meaning it was stopping. It wasn't growing anymore. And your economy has to grow because every year you obviously add more people to your population. So you have to have a bigger economy to give them the goods and services they need. But communism is a very inefficient system. Because the government plans everything, they can't react to changes in the market and the economy quick enough to get people what they need. There's a lack of consumer goods. So if you look down in the left-hand corner, you see a picture of Silly Putty. Everybody knows what Silly Putty is. You know, you give it to kids in their stocking on Christmas. The reason I put that is something that the Soviet Union would never make. That's what won the Cold War. The United States and the market economy, if there's a way to make money, somebody's going to make money off it. But in communism, only goods that make sense are made. And sometimes that leads to a market where there's no innovation. So the Soviets didn't have personal computers, while in the 1980s, Americans were beginning to buy the first Apple computers and the first cell phones were coming out. Instead, the Soviets spent all of their money on the arms race. They focused on what's called heavy industry, making weapons, making cars, things like that. And America's new president, Ronald Reagan, came to power, and he had a very simple goal. He wanted to actually try and defeat the Soviet Union, but again, he knows he can't do it through war, and his plan is simple. It's outspend the Soviets. He wants to use America's economic power to outspend the Soviet Union so much that it breaks their economy, and they have to kind of negotiate with the United States. You can see from these pictures the issues the Soviet economy was facing. There's literally no food at this butcher's, and there's bread lines, people trying to get into the grocery stores, which were a very common occurrence in the 80s in the Soviet Union. During all this turmoil in the Soviet Union, their next premier, so their version of a president, comes to power, and that's Mikhail Gorbachev, and he wants to reform the Soviet Union. He doesn't want to get rid of it, he wants to reform it and make it more efficient. So one of the first things he says is there's no more Warsaw Pact interventions. If your country is doing something that the rest of the Soviet Union doesn't like, or the Russia doesn't like, the Warsaw Pact isn't going to be used to come into your country and take control of it like it was in the 50s and 60s. He also signs those arm control treaties with the United States. You can see him and Ronald Reagan shaking hands down here in the bottom picture. And that is to make it so that the pressure for the Soviet Union to continually build up its military is kind of taken off, and it can begin to spend that money other places instead. His two plans to reform the Soviet Union are Glasnost and Perestroika, and these are very, very, very important to the end of the Cold War. So Glasnost means openness in Russian. And Gorbachev wants to get rid of the censorship in the Soviet Union. Originally in the Soviet Union, you could not say what you want, you could not print what you want, you could not get on the internet, or in the early years, there was all this censorship. And this encourages the Russian people to talk about the issues, or the Soviet people, sorry, the Soviet people to talk about the issues in the country. That obviously leads to discontent, but it also has the opportunity to restructure and make the government run a little better. His second plan is perestroika, which means restructuring. And this is reducing government influence. Gorbachev was a communist, but he saw that communism had some major issues. So he wants to reduce the government's influence in the economy and reform it and allow some capitalism. So this would allow those consumer goods to be made, not as much focus on the military, and try to eliminate those shortages that we went over in the previous slides. If you look at this cartoon, it's showing Gorbachev carrying a giant baby labeled Glasnost. And this cartoon, what it means is Glasnost is just kind of like a baby throwing a temper tantrum. But when it grows up, it's going to be a call for democracy and freedom. Because remember, Glasnost was ending censorship and allowing people to talk about government ideas. So as Glasnost becomes more ingrained in Soviet society, eventually it's going to become a demand for democracy and freedom, which is pretty much exactly what happens in only 3 or 4 years. The major effects of Glasnost and Perestroika is exactly the opposite, though, of what Gorbachev wants. It collapses the Soviet Union. It exposed the weaknesses and kind of the cracks in the Soviet Union. And because the state wasn't supporting the economy as much, it begins to collapse. Citizens in all the little republics of the Soviet Union begin to question the Communist Party and government. They begin to call for free elections, ending of censorship. You can see this little old lady here literally going through her purse on a former hammer and sickle, the symbol of the Soviet Union. And between 1989 and 1991, nations begin to break away from the USSR. They begin to say, we don't want to be part of the Soviet Union anymore. We don't want to be part of the Warsaw Pact. We want to have our own elections. They leave, and this is kind of the final blow to the Soviet Union, and is going to lead to it disappearing in 1991. In 1991, Soviet Union dissolves. It's no longer a thing. If you look at the cartoon in the upper right-hand corner, you see that like the big cruise ship is labeled USSR, and around it are all these little countries. Those are all the countries that were part of the USSR, and they're supposed to be like lifeboats. They're just getting away from the sinking ship that is the Soviet Union. These new republics that break away from the Soviet Union face a whole bunch of problems. Immediately, their economies collapse. They're not used to being without the support of the Soviet Union. They really have difficulty making it on their own. This is like if somebody, had no skills and just left their parents' house and didn't have an apartment, they didn't have a job. Obviously, they're not going to make it. There's a lot of violence because some people want to stay communist, some people don't want to be communist. So there's not a lot of civil wars, but there's a lot of like terrorism. And two of the big issues actually are ethnic violence. A lot of these countries have mixed ethnic groups that haven't liked each other for hundreds of years. That'll obviously lead to issues. And some of them had nuclear weapons. They had nuclear weapons stationed in their country from when they were a part of the USSR. Obviously, the United States doesn't want nuclear weapons spreading across the entire planet. So what will happen is there will actually be deals made with these little countries for them to give up their nuclear weapons, and then the United States would send them aid like loans and technical help to kind of get their economy started. This map here shows the Soviet Union and the nations that it broke up to. So obviously the biggest one is Russia, but all of these little nations were part of the Soviet Union. So they are going to get out and they're going to become their own countries. So the issues facing the newly independent nations from the Soviet Union are first and foremost economic. The command economy, and all command economy is communism, if you remember. The command economy is replaced with capitalism, the free market. So I will just write here COM for communism, and this one's capitalism, if you remember. Free market is capitalism. So they replace their economies, but that causes a lot of issues because the government had supported a lot of programs for all the people. So it's a rocky start for them transitioning. As the government stopped providing those goods and services to people under communism, it caused unemployment to rise because a lot of factories had to shut down. Prices for food went through the roof, crime rose, but eventually they began to integrate themselves with the modern world capitalist economy, and the standard of living of those new republics began to rise. Political issues, their transition to democracy. Most of these places had not had an actual election since 1940s and 30s, some even further, and they had to transition to a democracy. Places like Poland, within a year, had their first election, elected a president, and have never looked back. Other places like Russia had elections, but have slowly kind of slid backwards into almost like a dictatorship. As we know, they've had the same president under Putin for years, and it doesn't look like he's going to give up power anytime soon. So I know we said that we were going to go up to the Cold War, but I'm going to tack on a little bit of the post-Cold War years because this stuff is really important to understand the end of the Cold War and the major effects that it would have. So the most important thing that happens, in my opinion, after the Cold War is the breakup of Yugoslavia. And this is going to show the ethnic conflicts caused by the Cold War and caused by the breakup of communism. So Yugoslavia is right by Italy. It's south of the Soviet Union and in the area that we know as the Balkans. And after World War I, all the nations in the Balkans that had Slavs in it were jammed together into one country called Yugoslavia. And it is technically neutral during the Cold War. It is a communist nation. So Yugoslavia is communist, but they're not part of the USSR. They are under a dictator named Joseph Tito down there in the bottom left-hand corner. And he is so mean that he is able to keep Yugoslavia together. If you look at the map in the upper left-hand corner, you can see all those different little countries that are part of Yugoslavia. One of the issues is a lot of the ethnic groups hate each other. The Serbians and the Bosnians hate each other. The Croats and the Serbs hate each other. The Slovenes and the Croatians really don't like each other either. The Albanians don't like the Serbs. The Macedonians don't like the Montenegrins. So there's a lot of ethnic tension there. But Tito is able to keep them together because he's kind of like an iron-fisted dictator. But when he dies, Yugoslavia breaks up into a absolutely spectacular series of civil wars and violence because of all these ethnic groups. If you look in the map in the bottom right, you can see the different colors there, and it's an absolute mess, but that's where all the different ethnic groups live, and that's all the different ethnic groups in the country, and they're all so mixed in with each other, it's almost inevitable that there's going to be issues and wars after it breaks up. So you can look at this map here, even though it's in French. I couldn't find any map that wasn't in French for some reason. You can kind of see where the different ethnic groups live just by the colors and where they're going to have issues drawing borders. So Yugoslavia goes on to break up into 6 nations: Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. And Serbia is going to be the dominant power during this time. Serbia and Croatia will fight an early war to break away from each other, and then Serbia is going to try and hold together the rest of Yugoslavia pretty much under its control, especially Bosnia and Herzegovina. Nations begin to, like I said, break away through these violent civil wars, and a lot of these wars are still going on. Another level to the conflict is going to be religion. The Balkans is partially Muslim and partially Christian, and a lot of those people do not like each other in this area. So So the breakup of Yugoslavia kind of goes like this. After the country breaks up, the Serbs want to hold on to Bosnia because Serbs live there. So Serbia invades Bosnia, and in the Serbian areas, they begin to ethnically cleanse the areas of Bosnian Muslims. Ethnically cleanse is another type of genocide where the Serbians basically tell the Bosnian Muslims in that area either leave and leave it to the Serbs or die. The UN tries to stop the conflict for about 3 years through diplomacy and negotiations, and it fails. Now, by this time, the Soviet Union has totally collapsed, and the United States is in a very, very unique position where they are the only remaining superpower in the world. So, NATO, led by the United States, flexes its muscles and begins bombing Serbia to stop the war against Bosnia. After about a year, Serbia realizes that they're going to continue to be bombed, and in 1995, in Dayton, Ohio, the peace treaty called the Dayton Accords is signed, which ends the war. NATO is allowed to send in peacekeepers then to enforce the peace and end the genocide in that area. The other side of the conflict is in 1990s, the Kosovo War starts, and this is still going on. So Kosovo is technically part of Serbia, but it's ethnic Albanians. So they're Albanians living in Serbia, and they want to become part of Albania. The Serbs want to keep Kosovo, though. So the Serbs begin pushing the ethnic Albanians out. They begin ethnic cleansing again. They tell them, leave Kosovo, go to Albania, or obviously they'll kill you. NATO once again bombs Serbia and sends in a peacekeeping force. That peacekeeping force is still there. The issue of Kosovo, there was actually a ceasefire signed and orchestrated by the Trump administration very, very recently, but the issue kind of still remains, and there's a lot of ethnic tension in that area. So here is the issue of Kosovo. You can see the ethnic breakup. Most of it is Albanian, but there's just enough Serbians in that area to make it so the Serbs obviously want to keep it, because the ethnic Serbs want to stay with Serbia, and the people in Kosovo either want to create their own nation or go with Albania, and again causes a lot of conflict because of the mix-up of the ethnic groups. So moving on from Yugoslavia, you move on to the other remaining communist nations around the world. So as most communist nations were located in Europe, and as we've gone over, they switched to capitalism, but a few remain. China is still technically a communist nation, but they're running this like capitalist, socialist, dictatorship hybrid that has proven to be pretty successful. They're now the second largest economy on the planet, but it is extremely oppressive in China. They have a program called the Great Firewall of China, so you can't access the internet, and they track pretty much everything that you do. There's something called a social credit system where the Chinese Communist Party tracks your actions, and depending on how loyal and how good you are, you can get rewards or get punished from the Communist Party. Very, very oppressive. In Cuba, the Communist Party still rules. Castro died. His brother took over. His brother really has no interest in running the country, and slowly relations have improved with the United States. We all know North Korea, the totalitarian dictatorship. It's really not even communist. It's run by the Kim family. It's called the Hermit Kingdom because they pretty much sealed themselves off from the rest of the world other than China, and they are hardcore communist dictatorship there. Vietnam is technically communist, but they've been doing the same thing as China, running like this hybrid style. Their relations have improved with the rest of the world. Probably a lot of the clothing you're actually wearing right now is made in Vietnam and then exported, and they're beginning to reform and move towards capitalism. So as always, I have an effects slide. This is one of the most important slides in the whole presentation. And these are the major effects of the Cold War. So because of the fall of the Soviet Union, world power is 100% restructured. Everything changes. It gives birth to our modern world. One of the most important effects is the United States becomes the world's sole superpower. With the fall of the Soviet Union, for about the last 30 years, the United States has been on top of the world. We become what's called the world policeman. If there is a conflict, the United States goes there and puts it out. If there are pirates, the United States takes care of the pirates. If there's an economic dispute, the United States takes care of it. We led the war against terrorism. We have led to restructuring the trade system of the world. And that's kind of put the United States in the position of being the most powerful country on the planet. Capitalism becomes the world's economy because of this. While there are a few communist nations, they're fairly poor. A lot of them are switching to capitalism slowly, but capitalism is the world economy now. Because there's that power vacuum of the Soviet Union falling apart, China quickly fills it, and China is what's called a future superpower. They're the second most powerful economy in the world. They have one of the most powerful militaries, and they're a rising superpower that's kind of challenging the United States. In Europe, because the Warsaw Pact collapsed and the Soviet Union went away, the European Union expands. And the European Union is a voluntary cooperation of all the governments in Europe. Their idea is because they're all European, they share a heritage, so they should all work together. It's not totally a government, it's more of a just cooperative group. The goal of it is to preserve peace in Europe. If all the nations are connected to each other, if there's a place that they can talk in Europe, they'll avoid a war. And the European Union is, again, a rising power as it becomes more and more integrated. So I hope this helps make sense of the end of the Cold War. I know it's quite a bit, but you can use a lot of this on your project or to study for your test. And if you have any questions, just let me know.